Catacombs of Darkness. In the small English village of Crofthall, hidden among the endless hills and mists, there was an old church. Its moss-covered walls had seen more than 1 century of use, and the graveyard around it held ancient gravestones whose inscriptions had long since been erased by time. The locals rarely approached the church after sundown, considering the place cursed. "There's something ancient under the hill," the old-timers kept saying as children tried to explore the dungeons beneath the church. But one of those children, who grew up to become an archaeologist, decided to return to the village years later to uncover the mystery. His name was Thomas Ashby. "These are just legends," he assured his colleagues, standing at the church entrance. "But if there really are catacombs here, I will prove that they are real." Thomas had brought with him a team of 3: Anna, a history expert, Mark, an experienced speleologist, and Jake, a cameraman who would document everything. Armed with flashlights, ropes, and detectors, they began their exploration. Under the altar of the church was a massive stone slab with symbols carved into it. They looked like a mixture of Latin and rune inscriptions. Anna studied them while the others tried to move the slab. "Careful," she warned. "These symbols, they're warning of something." But Thomas only grinned. "Warnings are for those who are afraid, and we're looking for the truth." When the slab finally shifted, a stone staircase opened before them, going deep down. The air rising from the depths was cold and thick, smelling damp and decaying. "Let's go down," Thomas said, turning on the lantern. The stairs seemed endless. As they went deeper, the walls became wetter and wetter, and their footsteps echoed somewhere far ahead. Soon they found themselves in a huge stone hall, lit only by their lanterns. There were bones on the floor. "Human," Anna whispered, sitting down next to a skull. Jake, keeping his eyes on the camera, said nervously, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" But Thomas had already moved on, illuminating the walls covered with strange bas-reliefs. They depicted scenes none of them could explain. Hooded figures surrounded by something like a whirlwind, and a snake-like creature with a human face. "It's a cult," Anna said, "an ancient cult." And suddenly everything went silent. Not even the echo of their footsteps returned. "Why so quiet?" Mark asked, looking around. But there was no answer, and neither of them noticed as the door to the hall behind them slowly closed. Panic began to creep into the explorers' hearts as the door slammed shut behind them with a thud. Thomas was the first to point his flashlight at the massive slab of stone that now completely blocked the entrance. "It's just an old mechanism," he said, trying to sound confident. "I'm sure we can find a lever to open it." Anna scrutinized the bas-reliefs on the walls. They were getting stranger and stranger, as if they told a story, but there was no meaning in the images. One of them showed people, as if willingly walking into the jaws of a huge creature. "These images, they're clearly warning us," she muttered. "Or scaring us into leaving," Thomas argued. Jake, meanwhile, was checking the equipment. His camera was suddenly malfunctioning. The screen was flickering and the recording was jamming. "What the hell is that?" he swore, tapping the device. "It's going to be all right," Mark tried to cheer him up. "We just need to stick together." Thomas suggested moving on to find another way out. The stairs they descended led them to another corridor, but it was narrow and the walls pressed with their gloomy appearance. "It looks like a trap," Mark said, examining the walls, where strange metal spikes protruded in places. "A trap or a defense," Anna added. This passageway was clearly not designed for anyone to just walk through. They walked slowly, trying to avoid unexpected threats. Their footsteps echoed, and each felt as if there was something wrong with the silence. Soon the corridor led them into another room, large and circular, with a huge stone altar in the middle. On it lay a metal chest with symbols carved into it. "I wonder what's in there," Thomas said, reaching for the lid. "Wait," Anna shouted. "These symbols, they're warning of a curse." But Thomas ignored her. He opened the chest, and the contents made everyone freeze. Inside was a strange metal dagger and an ancient book with ragged pages written in ink that seemed too dark, as if written in blood. "These are artifacts," Anna whispered. "If we take them, it could ruin us." "Do you really believe that?" Thomas asked, raising his dagger. Its blade gleamed even in the dim light of the lanterns. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening rumble. The floor began to vibrate slightly, and whispers came from the walls. "What's that?" Jake shouted, covering his ears. The whispers grew louder and louder, turning into an inhuman howl. Invisible creatures seemed to surround them, and the air became almost tangible. "The book! Put it back!" Anna shouted, but Thomas had already opened the first page. A single phrase was written in a language no one knew, but its meaning seemed to be clear to everyone. "You have awakened what was sleeping." Suddenly, one of the walls of the room began to slowly unravel, revealing a passageway from which thick black smoke poured. "We have to get out of here," Mark shouted, grabbing Anna's arm. But Thomas stood motionless, as if hypnotized by something invisible. His eyes widened, and he suddenly began to move slowly toward the opening. "Thomas, no!" Anna shouted, but he had already disappeared behind the thick fog. Abysses. As Thomas disappeared behind the thick smoke, Anna, Mark, and Jake were left in a daze. The room began to seem smaller and smaller, as if the walls were shrinking, threatening to crush them. From the passage came faint moans and a strange beating, like a heart, but not human. "We can't just leave him there," Anna said, clutching the lantern so tightly that her fingers turned white. "Are you serious?" Jake exclaimed, his voice shaking. "You saw what just happened. This place, it's alive. We have to get out of here while we still can." Mark, looking around the campground, frowned. Thomas found Angel and the book. "Maybe they have something to do with what's going on here. We need to figure out what this place is. What if we just block the passage and leave?" Jake suggested. But before anyone could answer, a shout came from the smoky passage. "Thomas!" It was a shrill cry, full of pain and fear. "He's alive!" Anna shouted and rushed to the passage. "Wait!" Mark shouted, grabbing her shoulder. "If you go in there, you'll get us all killed." Anna lashed out, her face full of determination. "If we leave him here, we're already dead." She turned the flashlight on maximum power and stepped into the smoke. Reluctantly, but Mark and Jake followed her. The passage turned out to be long and winding. Their flashlights barely penetrated the dense smoke that drifted across the floor as if alive. The whispers grew louder, the words clearer. "They have come. They have freed us." "Who's talking?" Jake asked in a whisper, his hand shaking as he held the camera. "It's not people," Mark answered, trying not to show fear. They walked forward until the passage widened, revealing a huge hall. The ceiling was lost in darkness, and all around the room were stone columns with twisted, inhuman faces. In the center of the hall was Thomas. He stood with his back to them, arms down. In his right, he held a dagger, which was now glowing with a dim red light. "Thomas!" Anna shouted, but he didn't respond. She cautiously stepped closer. "Thomas, it's me, Anna. Look at me." Thomas turned around slowly. His eyes burned with a strange yellow light, and his face seemed alien. "It's not Thomas," Jake whispered, stepping back. "Yeah, see." Thomas wheezed, his voice sounding muffled, as if from the depths of a well. "They were here. They've always been here." "Who's they?" Anna asked, trying not to look away. "The Guardians," Thomas answered, his smile frightening. "They don't let those who woke them up leave." Suddenly he lunged at Anna with a dagger in his hand. Anna managed to dodge, but Thomas moved unnaturally fast. His movements were jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Thomas, it's us. Stop it," shouted Mark, trying to hold him back. But Thomas was too strong. He hit Mark so hard that he fell back against the wall, unconscious. Anna grabbed a rock from the floor and kicked Thomas in the arm, knocking out the dagger. Jake, finally gathering his strength, jumped up and knocked him to the ground. Thomas on the ground. "Hold him down," Anna shouted, grabbing the dagger. But as soon as she touched the blade, she felt dizzy. Images flashed before her eyes. Hooded men sacrificing on the altar, strange creatures crawling out of cracks in the ground. She heard a voice. "You have taken our power, now you are one of us." Anna let go of the dagger, her hands trembling. Meanwhile, Thomas had stopped resisting. He lay on the ground. His body was motionless and his eyes were human again. "Anna," he whispered, "they're coming." The hall fell into an oppressive silence. Thomas lay on the cold stone floor, his breathing ragged and his skin covered in drops of sweat. Anna, still shivering, took a few steps away, keeping her eyes on the dagger that now lay at her feet. What just happened?" Jake whispered, rising from the ground. I don't know," Anna mumbled, breathing hard. "But this place, it's changing. It's like it's absorbing us." Mark, coming to his senses, slowly stood up. There was a bloody scratch on his temple, but he looked focused. "We need to get out of here," he said firmly. "These symbols, this dagger, it's all part of some ritual. If we delay, we become part of it." Thomas suddenly raised his head sharply. His eyes, which had barely calmed down, flashed yellow again. "You don't understand anything," he wheezed. "We're already locked in. They won't let us go." His words were like a sentence. Anna turned to the bas-relief walls and noticed that the images had changed. They were now depicting them: Anna, Mark, Jake, and Thomas. One of the bas-reliefs showed Thomas holding a dagger while something huge and ominous rose up behind him. "That's impossible," she whispered, stepping back. "It's a warning," Mark said. "We activated the ritual ourselves by opening the chest." Jake, gathering all his courage, turned on his camera and started filming the bas-reliefs. "People need to know what happened here," he muttered. But as soon as the camera captured the images, the screen began to flicker. A whisper came from the speakers, distorted and ominous. "Jake, turn it off," Anna shouted. But he didn't have time. The camera exploded in his hands, burning his fingers and knocking out what little confidence he had left. "They don't want us to leave with the evidence," Mark said grimly. Anna looked at the dagger again. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. "Perhaps we can undo what we've set in motion," she suggested. "This dagger is the key. If we figure out how to use it, or it will kill us," Mark added grimly. Thomas rose to his feet, his movements still unnatural. He looked at Anna as if pleading. "Don't try to fight it," he said. "This is stronger than we are, stronger than anything we know." "Then why did you take this book?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. "Because I had to," Thomas replied. "This place requires sacrifice." They decided to return to the passage they had come from, but now it was blocked by a massive stone wall. "We're trapped," Jake said. "There's no way out." "There has to be," Anna said confidently. "This place was made by humans, so it must have a logic." They began to explore the walls, trying to find a lever or a hidden door. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder. Now they sounded like laughter. Suddenly, the floor began to shake, and cracks appeared in the center of the hall. Thick black smoke began to ooze out of them, forming the outline of a huge figure. "This is it," Thomas whispered, kneeling down. Anna raised her dagger and pointed it at the smoky creature. "We will not be your victims," she said, her voice trembling but with determination. The creature slowly approached, its form becoming more and more distinct. It was a monster with human features, but its eyes were empty and its mouth stretched to an unrealistic size. "Do you think you can resist?" A voice progressed. Anna gripped the dagger tighter. "We'll see about that." The creature approached slowly. Its silhouette trembled, as if it were made up of many shadows mixed in a chaotic swirl. A booming voice echoed through the hall, penetrating every crack, every empty space. "You woke us?" it repeated, sounding both reproachful and threatening. "You belong to us now." Anna, Mark, and Jake stood huddled together in a tight group, instinctively trying to take cover behind each other. Thomas, still on his knees, looked hypnotized. His lips silently whispered words no one could understand. Anna clutched the dagger, and her hands trembled. She knew this blade was the key, but how? It was too small to harm a creature that seemed larger than the room itself. "What do you want?" She shouted out in desperation. The creature stopped. Its silhouette became clearer, and from its smoky body emerged two huge eyes, black as the abyss, with thin streaks of purple light. "Blood," it answered. "Old blood. The one who awakened me must give it." Anna looked back at Thomas. His face had gone blank. He looked like a man who had had his soul taken from him. "Is that him?" she asked the creature. "Him and you," came the reply. "You're all connected to this place now." Jake looked around the room worriedly. "We can't just stand here and listen to this. We have to find a way out." Mark walked over to the walls, examining them closely. He noticed that the symbols on the bas-reliefs had begun to glow slowly with a dim green light. "These symbols are being activated," he said. "I think they point the way." Anna stood in front of the creature, feeling its pressure, as if the darkness itself had descended on her shoulders. "If we give you what you want," she asked, "will you let us go?" The creature laughed. That laugh was like 1,000 voices sounding simultaneously. "You think your sacrifice is going to make a difference? But I will offer you a deal." The creature reached out from its smoky body with something resembling a hand and pointed to the dagger in her hands. "Pierce him," it said, nodding at Thomas. "No!" Mark shouted, running closer. "We can't do that." Anna froze. She looked at Thomas, who didn't even seem to realize what was happening. His eyes were blank, but a faint smile appeared on his lips, as if he had accepted his fate. "It's the only way," he said quietly. "No," Anna whispered. "We will find another way out." She raised her dagger, but not to strike Thomas. She turned to the creature. "You want my blood? Take it." The creature froze for a moment, its shadows wavering. "You don't know what you're doing," it hissed. "Maybe," Anna replied. "But if I die, you won't get the others." She swung the dagger and plunged it into her palm. Blood trickled down the blade, dripping onto the stone floor. The dagger began to glow with a bright red light, and the creature's shadows trembled, its form beginning to blur. Even brighter streams of light began to emerge from cracks in the floor. "What have you done?" screamed the creature shrilly. The floor vibrated, the walls began to crumble, and the hall descended into chaos. Thomas suddenly fell to the ground, his body twitching convulsively and his eyes filled with fear again. Anna felt the dagger like it was draining her of her strength, but she didn't let it go. She knew it was their only chance. "Run!" she shouted to the others. Jake and Mark scooped Thomas up and dragged him toward the passage, which somehow opened again. But Anna stayed where she was, holding the dagger and watching the creature disintegrate. "We'll come back for you," Mark shouted. "No," replied Anna. "If you go back, it will start all over again." The last thing she heard was their screams, and then the hall exploded with light. By the time Mark, Jake, and Thomas got outside, the church had already begun to collapse. They ran to a safe distance and turned around, watching as the old building was swallowed by darkness. "She saved us," Mark whispered. "But we lost her," Jake replied. Thomas stood silent, his eyes no longer glowing, but there was sadness in them. "She made the right decision," he said finally. "Otherwise we'd all still be there." The church finally collapsed, and from beneath the rubble rose a light that quickly disappeared. It had been several days since Mark, Jake, and Thomas had gotten out of the cursed dungeon. They were in a small village nearby, in the home of a local priest who had offered them shelter. All three of them looked exhausted, both physically and mentally. "We have to tell people what happened out there," Jake said, sitting at the window, looking out at the field covered in morning mist. "What do you say?" Mark asked darkly. "That we awakened an ancient evil and it destroyed our friend? No one would believe us." "But Anna, she sacrificed herself to save us," Jake insisted. "We can't just put this behind us." Thomas sat in the corner of the room, pensively leafing through the very book he'd taken from the dungeon. The pages of the book were filled with strange symbols and drawings. He had tried to burn it several times, but the fire had never left a trace of it. "This book is the key," he said at last. "It says something about sealing evil, but I can't decipher it yet." Mark sighed heavily. Do you want to go back there? No, Thomas answered. But I want to understand what it was. If there are more places like this, who knows how much evil is hidden beneath our feet? The next day they decided to go to London, hoping to find historians or experts who could help them understand the contents of the book. They didn't talk much on the way, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. Jake kept his hands on the remains of his camera, which had been partially repaired. There were a few blurry images of bas-reliefs and strange symbols in its memory. If this gets into the hands of the scientists, they might uncover more, Jake said, staring at the screen. What if it awakens something else? Mark asked, his voice cold. Then we have to be ready, Thomas answered, holding the book tightly. When they arrived in London, their first order of business was a visit to the British Museum. There they met with Professor Edward Haywood, a specialist in ancient cults. This is not just an artifact, Haywood said, scrutinizing the book. This is one of the oldest records associated with the so-called cult of shadows. These people believed that powerful entities lived underground that could be controlled, but only at the cost of great sacrifice. Control? Jake interjected. Yes, but apparently they failed, the professor continued. The entities not only rejected their control, but destroyed the ritualists themselves. Then why did the book survive? Mark asked. Perhaps it was left behind as a warning, suggested Haywood. Later, back at his rented apartment, Jake tried to download the saved footage from the camera to his laptop. But when he opened the files, the screen flickered. It can't be, he muttered, looking at the images. New details began to emerge that hadn't been there before. Smoky silhouettes, eyes in the dark, and a figure that resembled Anna. That's impossible, Jake shouted, drawing Mark and Thomas's attention. They ran over and looked at the screen. In the very center of one of the frames was Anna. She stood with a dagger in her hand, her face pale but determined. Is that her? Mark whispered. It looks like it, Thomas replied, staring at the image. The screen began to flicker more intensely, and a low whisper came from the speakers. You haven't finished. Come back. The words came out so clearly that a chill ran down the spine of all three of them. It's a trap, Mark said. We're not going back. But Thomas was staring at the book in his hands. What if it's not a trap? He asked. What if she's still alive? The whispering from the speakers didn't stop. It grew louder, becoming a low rumble that echoed in their minds. Jake closed the laptop, hoping to drown out the frightening sound, but it didn't go away. That's impossible, he said, backing away from the table. It's just an old recording. It's not real. It is real, Thomas replied, scrutinizing the book. This place still holds us. We've never been free. Mark grabbed the book from his hands and raised it above his head. If this thing is to blame for everything, we'll just destroy it. No, Thomas shouted, snatching the book back. You don't understand. It's the only thing that can help us. Mark clenched his fists, his face contorted with anger. Help? She's only causing trouble. We have to put all this behind us. We can't, Thomas said quietly. His voice sounded detached. We have started a mechanism that cannot be stopped. At that moment, the light in the room flickered, and shadows began to appear in the corner. They formed the outline of a human figure. Is that Anna? Jake whispered, gazing into the shimmering form. The figure didn't answer, but raised a hand, pointing to the book in Thomas's hands. Her lips moved slowly, and they heard the words, barely audible amid the whispered sounds. Come back, complete, save me. That night was filled with arguments and doubts. Thomas was adamant that they should return to the ruins of the church and try to complete the ritual. Jake had his doubts, but his desire to understand what had happened began to outweigh his fear. Mark, on the other hand, remained adamantly opposed. We just survived this nightmare, he insisted. Why risk it again? Because she's still in there, Thomas shouted, pointing to the book. She saved us, but she paid the price. We can't leave her. You don't know if she's alive, Mark objected. This place is trying to lure us back. Jake was silent, still holding the camera. He remembered the moment when Anna had come between them and the creature, risking everything. "I'll go," he finally said. Mark turned to him in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" "Maybe," Jake replied, "but I can't just move on, knowing that we could have done something and didn't." Thomas nodded, and they began to get ready to go back. In the early morning, they stood in front of the ruins of an old church. The wreckage of the building looked peaceful, as if everything that had happened was just a terrible dream. But the silence was deceptive. "This is a bad idea," Mark said, standing behind them. "We're all going to die. If you're afraid, you can stay here," Thomas replied, holding the book tightly. Mark looked around the ruins, gritting his teeth, and finally reluctantly followed the others. As they got closer, the ground beneath them began to shake. Black smoke rose again from the cracks, and the whispering returned. "You're here again. You're not leaving." Jake turned on the camera, hoping to capture everything that would happen. Thomas opened the book and began to read words that he had not understood before. But now, as if by magic, they made sense. "It's an ancient language," he whispered. "I don't know how, but I understand it." The words from the book echoed through the ruins, and the smoke began to gather into a single point, forming the same dark figure as before. "You dare to wake me again?" came the voice of the creature. "We have come to finish what we started," Thomas shouted, his voice trembling but with determination. The creature laughed, its dark form growing, filling the air around it. "You will not complete. You are mine now, all of you." Light began to break through the darkness, coming from the book. Thomas continued to recite the spell even as the creature began to approach him. Jake and Mark stood by his side, not knowing what to do. "It's working," Jake shouted. "Keep going." But suddenly the figure stopped, and a female silhouette appeared from its center. It was Anna. "Anna!" Mark shouted, rushing toward her, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "Stay back," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm part of this now." "No!" Thomas shouted, stopping his reading. "This is the only way," Anna continued. "You must finish it. Destroy the book while it is open." Thomas froze, realizing what that might mean. "You will disappear with it," he whispered. "If I stay, he will exist," Anna replied. "Do it." She turned to the creature, her gaze full of determination. "You won't hold them back any longer." Thomas picked up the book, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He threw the book into the center of the glowing circle, and the flames instantly engulfed it. The creature screamed, its dark form beginning to disintegrate. Anna smiled before disappearing with the darkness. When it was over, the three friends stood among the ruins. The darkness was gone, and the sun illuminated the place that had once been cursed. "We did it," Jake said, but his voice sounded hollow. "We lost her," Mark replied. Thomas didn't say anything. He stared at the ashes left by the book and thought about the fact that Anna had given everything to save them. "She set us free," he finally said. "We must live so that her sacrifice was not in vain." And though the terrible adventure was over, each of them knew that the darkness would always find a way to return.